hang me out to dry. Oh, and bless me while I wait. Oh, to stand in pure white glory for my judgment at the gate. Oh, my holy stained blue, precious moon white shade lifted. Oh, my blood so warm, so sifted. Oh, my holy stained lifted.
Good evening. Welcome. My name is Alessandra Moctezuma and I'm the gallery director here. I'm also a professor lead of museum studies, and I'm so happy that you're joining us here today to hear Larry and Debbie Kline talk about their work, about their process, and show us some of the pieces. You've seen the exhibit. It's pretty wild, huh?
Yes.
Really amazing. So I just first want to say that this is a collaboration of us working with the artists, working with our students, and so Debbie and Larry were here before it got really hot, actually. I think the weather was still pleasant, but for 2 weeks they were here working with our students. I realized that maybe we brought too much when we went into the storage space and it was filled from the bottom to the ceiling with boxes. But I actually had the opportunity of seeing Debbie and Larry's work several years ago. My advanced museum studies class curates an exhibit at a venue in San Diego. They have to find the venue and they have to find the artist. They do a call for artists. So several years ago, a group of students sent out a call for proposals and call for artists, and Debbie and Larry Kline sent in their work. And I remember the excitement when, as a group, as a class, we saw their website and we saw their pieces. And at that time, we really wanted, I remember the students really wanted to show the Enlightenment piece, the columns. But then this show was Space for Art. They were very generous to offer us their gallery, but it was only going to be for a week. And so we realized that this was going to be a huge endeavor and it was going to be just too difficult. So at that time, the students went and did a studio visit and they selected some works from the candy store. And I was just so thrilled. That show was fabulous. And later I arranged to do a studio visit, and they would show me a piece and I said, oh, we have to have that. And they would show me something else, and I said, oh, we have to have that. And that's why the show ended up, the gallery filled with so much work. But I love it. I think it looks great. I think it introduces our students to the breadth and kind of the depth of issues that they deal with. I also think I chose their work because they have a sense of humor. They're provocative, and yet they invite us in because they also make us smile. And so I really like that about their work. And they have shown their work here locally, but also in San Francisco, all the way to across the ocean in Israel. They had an exhibit at a museum there. So they're artists that are recognized. They've done public art pieces. And the caliber of work that they bring here is just fantastic. So I'm not gonna, I know they're gonna talk about their work, so I'm not gonna continue, but I just wanted to thank my museum studies students. Andrew is here. He helped with the installation. The finishing touch of an exhibition is the lighting. You can have a most beautiful show, but if you don't have the right lighting, it might not work. But Andrew did a masterful work in the lighting, so thank you. And then we had so many other students that assisted, many of our students that helped today with the reception and that have been gallery sitting. And so I want to thank all of them. And of course, Pat Vine, who's never here because she's always managing, the cleanup, but she's my gallery coordinator and she helps with all the myriads of details. So just so that you know that, without her, we couldn't get all these things done. And all the wonderful staff that we have at Mesa, Michael Gast, and all the other people that help us. So after their talk, we will have some time for Q&A. So if you want to stay, if you have some questions, you can jot them down, and we can ask them at the end. And thank you so much for coming. They also will be doing a gallery talk on September 20th, a Friday at 1 p.m. in the gallery. So to show a little bit more about their process, their ceramics, they show some of them also. All right, so thank you so much for coming, and here's Debbie and Larry Kline. Thank you.
Switch papers.
This is messy.
I don't know. Do you want to turn down the light a little? It's up to you guys.
Yeah.
Can you
Could be
turn
turned
it
down
down
a
a
bit.
little? Okay.
I'll dim it over.
Little ambiance, little mood music, perhaps.
Little wine.
Little wine. Mom. No. Okay, so he's Debbie. No. We're Debbie and Larry Kline. I am Debbie. And just to expound on what she said a little bit, you should know that Larry and I both have museum careers before, and we watched a lot of people in museums walk right by some of the most significant artworks of our time and beyond our time. And with that, when we started making artwork together, we decided that it was very important to do something that made people, number one, turn their head and look at it, right, and pay attention to it. And then, after we get them, then we can kind of, well, I say slap around a little bit, but, make you think a little bit more. And that's the topic of the exhibition is poke. And of course, everybody who's on Facebook knows what that means, right? And so the provocateurs that we try to be plays into that as well. So, and Larry had some things he wanted to say.
Well, I guess the first thing, actually something really important about what we do is we embrace the spirit of play in the work that we do. And that doesn't mean play without intention. You can play and still do something that ends up, being very serious and have sort of greater meaning. But I think everybody that develops something, whether you're an artist, whether you're working in the sciences, whatever it is, you basically take what exists already and you kind of stand on top of that, and then you see what potential it has, how you can tweak it, what other things you can do with it. And that's what happens with a lot of the pieces that we have here. And I think that's also why it has like a sort of duality to it. There are objects or maybe techniques that might be familiar, but we're kind of using it in a way that it's not normally done. And that's part of the idea of playing with it. The towers, for example, are made from low fire clay, and they're 8 feet tall. And anybody who really knows about clay knows that's an insane thing to do, right? You just don't do it. But and probably if we knew, we might not have attempted that. But the idea was to kind of play with the technology that we had, and we said, what else can you do with this? Well, can you make architecture out of this little sort of crap that's meant to be, in this kind of scale?
And with a kiln that is only about,
Yes, it fired one segment at a time, so this thing kind of like progressed.
Took a while. Also, I want to backtrack just a second and then to say something else about what Alessandra said. We do sincerely thank all of the interns who worked on this show. You are the most dedicated, wonderful group of students we have ever worked with in that way, and we appreciate it. I just want to say, I know there are more, especially the gallery sitters, but I don't know all your names, but I do know, number one, Pat, I just saw you walk in here. Thank you, girl, everybody. She's the engine. And of course, Alessandra. And then there was Andrew, as we mentioned before. And Kim, I saw you there. Is Sarah here? Also Elizabeth. Yes. And I think we got everybody who worked immediately with us. If I forgot anybody, please forgive us. But now, I wanted to make sure we said that. So that we're talking about the Age of Enlightenment. And this particular column is called Crusading Angels. And I don't know if any of you got to read the wall didactics and things like that, but this whole piece is about religion and conflict. Did you want to say anything else about that particularly?
Well, It's about that, and it's also about the fact that symbols mean different things to different people in different contexts, so that all symbolism is kind of fungible and changeable in a way. And a lot of these pieces, there were a lot of transitions through them, and also a lot of sort of happy accidents. This, for example, that you're looking at, you can see there's an angel with a bandaged leg. This actually happened because we were working with, we had a crew of interns, probably 6 interns that worked with us over the course of a year to make these. And, we were making them very quickly, maybe thinking later the context, and this angel was poured and it was put in a basket, and it rained and it filled with water and the leg disintegrated. And, some people would look at it and go, oh, this is horrible, it's destroyed, we have to start again. But, immediately the idea is, well, we'll bandage the leg. And then we looked at the foot, and the foot, if you look on the left foot over here, it has what looks like a high heel. Well, that's actually the sprue for pouring the ceramic in, and usually those things are cut off.
I hear you.
And so we thought, don't ask, don't tell. All these things that kind of immediately pop into your mind, and then you make a decision: is this something we want to keep, or we don't want to keep?
So there are little nuances all over that piece, and all of our other pieces too, that sometimes you would never see unless you really look at it very closely. And even some of our interns don't know some of the details that we're telling in this. And of course then this piece also talks about crusades and Christian crusades, and as you can see down here at the bottom, the little angel with this whole thing of crutches. Religion, it's a wonderful thing to have and to hold, and we say this at Rosh Hashanah. For those of you who might be Jewish and still here tonight, I know there are a few. But religion creates such a conflict, and of course here we have this little guy with all these crutches because there are so many casualties of war.
And I think also something that these towers make evident is the way that religions tend to borrow from each other. You see iconography that kind of rings through all of these things, and that's something that people don't talk about. They talk about the differences in religion, not recognizing those connections. So what we decided we're going to do is actually have some stills of each one of the columns and maybe a few different images of it to kind of show you the transition that sometimes happens as you work your way up.
Also important to note is a lot of these are commercially made molds, and the woman we bought the kiln from gave them to us because she was moving and didn't know what to do with them. So we took them thinking, I don't know what to do with these either. As artists, we would never, make commercial molds and sell, Santa Clauses and whatever. So we kept them for a long time, and just before we were ready to throw them out, all of a sudden we started looking at them and realized there's a nice piece here. We could use these. And so that's what the genesis of the piece, pun intended, started.
So this particular piece, the Crusading Angels, you work your way up the column. There's an angel missing arms, and the angels are all crying. And then at the very top of this, there's kind of a weird thing happening. Well, you have the angel at the very top is actually tearing this thing apart. And then underneath that, you see these images. The images are a Thanksgiving turkey and a baby Jesus.
Several baby Jesus.
Yes, as you work your way around. And we immediately chose these things because they keystone really well together. They fit well on the form, and they look like they were meant to be. And then immediately we're looking at them and thinking, well, in a way these are all sacrificial, and they're all sacrificial for the benefit of others, you could say.
Except every Thanksgiving our president pardons a turkey.
True. And then we have this column, which is the Great Transformation, Santa into Moses. So if you look inside the sarcophagus, you will actually see the mold that this was made from. It is a Santa Claus mold. But we realized that this wasn't your standard Santa. He wasn't jolly looking. It was sort of like a dour, old world Santa. And we realized that this could be transformed in this way. So it actually became Moses. We put horns on him because this is the way he was represented in the Middle Ages and also in the Renaissance. In fact, there's a very well-known Michelangelo statue with Moses with horns. It's said to be a mistranslation of the Hebrew, and the Hebrew was something to emanate from, and they read that as something physically coming out of the head, and they would represent it with horns. But then you could also say,
really
well,
a halo, I think.
True. But you could also say, well, maybe this was actually intentional and it was meant to sort of demonize. We don't know. But all these things have potential. And then what he's actually holding is sort of a simplified version of the Ten Commandments, which is be nice, the short version.
Which actually, we stole that piece from some really great artists. It was Debbie and Larry Kline.
We don't-
We did another piece called Be Nice, so we plugged it there.
Sometimes these things do get recycled in some way.
Yeah, which everybody knows that.
On the flip side, you have Moses actually starting to cover his eyes. This could be read in two ways. One, it could be on the Sabbath, you actually light the candles and cover your eyes and let the light kind of come through the cracks in your fingers. Or the other thing could be, you could say, be nice, or I don't even want to know what you're doing. On the flip side of it.
Also, on the base of that column, that you might have noticed that there's some Hebrew writing. And we put that there because it is actually the actual translation of the Christian Ten Commandments. Jews have something like 400 and something that they're supposed to adhere to, but the Christian Ten Commandments are, the ones that everybody knows, and they're marketed very well. But anyway, so we put it in the Hebrew writing because we thought that was kind of a nice mix, and all of those religions borrow one from another, and they're all interrelated, even though everybody thinks that they have, the best religion, and it's the pure religion, if you will. And we were the whole piece is talking about those interconnections and borrowing and stealing and fighting and go on.
Then we have a column that's directly across from that. It's called Order Steeped in Chaos. The pattern in this is actually a traditional Muslim design, an Islamic pattern, and it's actually a Jewish star on its side. So it also kind of talks about conflict in that way. And then at the top of this, of course, it's damaged. So you've got this sort of very beautiful, precise, geometric, mathematical column, and yet it's also in chaos and disintegrating simultaneously. And we always put this one across from the Moses column because there's a sort of constant back and forth that seems appropriate with that one.
This is Prayers for Peace, Conga Line Buddhas. And again, we had all these molds. There's a whole bunch of Buddhas in them, so we made a Buddha column. And this has turned out to be sort of an audience favorite, if you will. I hope you all got a chance to write your prayers or dreams and put them in there. And I believe, are you still going to post those? They're going to be posted on Facebook, so watch and see if yours comes up. They'll be anonymous, so don't worry about that either in case you disclose some secret.
Don't sign your name to them.
Right, don't sign your name. Even if you did sign your name, they'll be anonymous, don't worry.
If you sign your name, Hotai won't grant it.
Yeah, he will. But this is also, it's also about prayers, it's also about wishing for things, it's also about myths, all of those things combined. And it just seemed appropriate to have this with the Buddhist column.
So here we have the conga line Buddhas. And again, when we built this piece, we weren't exactly sure how people were going to respond to it, or actually even if people were going to respond to it. We first showed this in a museum, and then we got a call, and they said, you got to empty the Buddhas. So we thought, okay, we'll empty the Buddhas. And
Which is a sentence that's never been said, we think.
It's very possible. So we emptied the Buddhas, and then we got a call, every couple of weeks, you got to empty the Buddhas out again. And then finally, we realized we had this great big bag full of wishes and dreams, a really powerful thing, metaphorically. And it took us a very long time to read these because we felt, in some sense, that it might be even a betrayal of trust, that people put them in this thinking no one would ever see them. But we thought about it for a long time, and eventually we couldn't resist. And so we read a few of these. And we had an intern with us who'd been working with us for about a year. And she was just, she put it the most clearly. She said, I went to the opening and everybody was having such a wonderful time and they were hugging and smiling.
Just like tonight.
And then she read the things that were put in the Buddha's belly. And there were, things about failed relationships, and there were things about people having terminal illnesses, and all of these very, very serious things. So it kind of also changed the way that we looked at the work that we were making, that we didn't really think of this as kind of like so much a lighthearted thing, and that did happen, but we're shocked by the fact that people really kind of bared their souls putting this in. It's almost a psychological catharsis in some way.
Yeah, there's a very strange responsibility that came with that, as he was mentioning, that we we were careful on what we did with these. And finally, we actually did start posting those on Facebook, again, anonymously, but also because we thought if they were out into the world, perhaps these wishes and dreams would come to fruition somehow. Like we had some sort of magical power. Facebook does, as we all know. But nonetheless, when we started posting them, then people from all across the country started saying, I need to send something through the Buddha's belly. So people started mailing us things. And now we have quite a collection of these. So that we'll see what happens with them at this iteration.
And then we have this column which deals with serpent mythologies called Medusa in the Garden. Now some of these are commercially made molds, and then some of these are handmade objects. We made the snake and we made the apples and a lot of the elements on this. And then as you work your way down, you have Medusa. And Medusa actually began as a baby doll head, and the snakes coming out of the head were actually chili peppers. So watching the transformation.
That's what Medusa was really made out of.
Absolutely. We know the real story.
But again, it's one of those things where we're borrowing from even the molds and changing the meaning of it. Again, we had an intern at this point, and he actually pulled that mold the first time, and he looked at the baby doll head and said, "Oh, she's so beautiful." And then he watched me as I started carving the eyes into these little snake eyes, and he goes, "That's just so wrong." And of course, then we completed with snakes all around, and there's snake scales that go all around this particular piece. And of course, then it talks not only about Medusa, but it also talks about the Garden of Eden and the apples, and if indeed it was an apple, we don't really know, but some sort of fruit that people partaked in that ended up casting them out of the garden. And those mixing of those myths, if you will, were kind of fun to play with.
And then we have Multiply and Divide, which is dealing with reproductive science and religion. Again, a difficult thing to talk about in a lot of senses. But so at the bottom we have Easter bunnies, and we have all the stuff that deals with reproduction and multiplying. And as you work, yes, and as you work your way up the column, we have these eggs, which are oops, went the wrong way. There we go. Did I go too many?
Yep, yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So they work their way up the column, and then we have these figures, and we're not exactly sure the origin of these figures. She seems to be holding something that actually looks a little bit sort of a cross between an embryo and actually a Buddha baby, and we're not exactly sure what it is. But we immediately recognized this sort of transition with the eggs, and so behind her are all these little sort of sperm and eggs carved into the side of the column.
So this has to do with everything from reproductive science and where it's going, test tube babies, if you will. And of course, beginning with the bunnies at the bottom, talks about Easter and religion. And that was all based on a pagan religion. So, we kind of played with that and moved it around a little bit, or up the column, as you will. This one is called the War Prayer. And anybody here ever heard of Samuel Clemens?
Yeah,
Mark Twain. Good, thank you. We have readers. I love it. Mark Twain wrote this wonderful book called The War Prayer, and it's a prayer. You can go online and read it, and those of you who are students should write it down, because you should read this. It's a story, if you will, that Mark Twain wrote, and he said that it could not be published until after his death because it was so controversial. And it was, in essence, there was a church congregation, and they were sending their boys off to war, and they were all praying, number one, that they would be safe, and that they would slay their enemy, and that they would be victorious, and that the light at the end of the tunnel would be that they came home safely. And there's a stranger who appears in the back of the church, and he walks forward and he says, I can grant you that wish, but before I do, I want you to know what you're wishing for. And he said, what you're wishing for, or what you're praying for, is the death of the children of the mothers of the other community. And what you're praying for is the torture and the pain of losing children and people to war. So you can see how this would be a little controversial. And I do challenge to go read it. But this is, we made this column because, again, these are the praying hands. Am I doing all right?
Mhm.
But the praying hands, and the ones at the top are praying up, and we kind of see that as praying for lofty goals. The ones at the bottom are pointing down. So those of you who might be on a football team, when they say, yeah, let's go win, and they're praying before the game, think about what you're really praying for. And I think it's a very valid insight.
And this one is called the Tower of Babel. And this has, sort of anything and everything. So we went to the source, the great font of all molds, and we looked for everything. John Wayne is in there. Sneezy from the Seven Dwarfs is in there. And, of course, the ubiquitous baby doll head.
Yeah, with the forked tongue.
But also, we have these things right here. We have these hands that are giving all these different signals. These things actually emerged from a set of praying hands mold. And so it was interesting, obviously we do everything wrong, so you're supposed to put these things in the mold and you take them out when they're, good and hard and they're leather hard, and they're going to give you the mold that you wanted. We instead took these things out when they were good and sopping wet, and some of them just completely fell apart. But some of them were, stiff enough that they allowed us to sort of cut these things apart and articulate them in different ways. And suddenly all these signs started coming out, everything from, live long and prosper to gang signs. And the idea is that, symbols mean different things to different people, and they're all changeable. And this is kind of like the ultimate, I think, iteration of that in some ways. And the idea, at least for me, metaphorically, that these things all emerged from a set of praying hands is a really, really interesting thing. And then they went out in the world and they became what they were going to become.
Oh, and in case you don't know, the story of the Tower of Babel is that civilization built this tower up to God, and they thought that they were so mighty, the humans were mighty enough to build a tower that was high enough to reach the heavens. And at that point, God went, no, you're not. And he tore down the temple, and he divided the people, and this is where the different languages were supposed to have happened.
So we could no longer communicate, we could no longer organize to do something like that. This is actually where it all began. This is one of the little vignettes called the Enlightenment. And this was the first set of molds that we actually played with. And we had this little thing emerge from it, and at that time we were doing something with California Center for the Arts Museum, and we said, well, this could potentially grow into something bigger, but we don't really know what. And it was very nice that they actually really had the faith in us to just say, okay, we like what you're doing, we want to do something with you, and we trust that you'll make something interesting from this. And from here it grew into the monster that it is today.
Which is interesting that they used faith and trust, and then we made this whole piece that talks about those things.
Oh, you're good.
I know. That's why you married me. And before I go on, I did notice something on the other one. For those of you who are ceramicists and perfect ceramicists, I won't apologize for it, but I do want to note that the pieces that we have made, you'll see rough edges on these. And we decided to leave those rough edges because we wanted people to know that they're from molds and that they came commercially. And we thought that that was sort of important to the piece. Now, to continue, this piece again is Seeing is Believing. And we have here a picture of a mariner slaying a mermaid, which is a myth. Not the mariner, but the mermaid. There in the front is a leprechaun, and over on the your right hand side is Jesus in a Christmas ball. So these are all really, to some extent, mythological constructs. And we thought it was kind of interesting to sort of put them all together and make those comparisons. Everybody can make their own comparisons for them. But seeing is believing.
This one is called Promises Unfulfilled. This is actually the same figure that was on Multiply and Divide. Now she has been morphed into something else. She's basically becoming a vessel, giving of herself to angels that, nothing ever comes out, so they don't receive anything. They just perpetually wait for something to happen that never arrives.
Now, again, there are little nuances to these pieces, and this one, of course, has to do with women and the strength that women have, and being a vessel. It could be talking about women and having childbirth, women becoming vessels for love and nurturing, those kinds of things. But in this one, that's been separated.
And we have this one. This is Art from the Trenches. This was actually made, we made a mold from an artillery shell that my grandfather brought back from World War I. And this was, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of trench art before, but it's something that soldiers did. You know, in World War I, people were mired down in trenches for months at a time, looking for some way to, you know, keep themselves sane and occupied. One of the things is they would do is actually make art from whatever materials they had. And also the artisans that were local would go out into the fields and they'd pick up these shells because there was, of course, you know, lack of all sorts of materials. So anything that they could use, they would take advantage of.
Art survives.
Yeah, so this became sort of a luminaria, something beautiful and giving from basically weapons of destruction.
And these are all a little associated vignettes to the piece, and this one sort of is the final piece that we made, and it talks about all of the war and the conflict that has been caused by religion. And, you know, we're not saying that any religion is bad, we're not saying that any religion is good. What we're saying is that pay attention to what religion is doing, and of course with the things that are happening even right now in Syria, you know, the issue comes up again. And so for those reasons, the piece we think is very significant.
And then at sort of the end of this colonnade, you come to the sarcophagus. These are some of the actual molds that the pieces are made of, so you can kind of see some of those familiar forms in this itself. And also it looks like a tomb very much. And this is the interior view. And now we'll move on to maybe something lighter.
Maybe, but probably not.
Maybe, but not entirely. So this is something else that Debbie and I have been doing for years. We actually started doing these when we met in art school many, many years ago.
Pay attention, students. This is when it begins.
Never actually really thought of this even as an extension of our art in any way. But, you know, at night, you know, during the day we would stay in the studio as long as we could. Sometimes we would sneak in and work at night when we weren't supposed to be there.
Don't do that. It's bad.
When eventually we would get caught, you know, in the middle of the night and they'd throw us out, we would go to an all-night restaurant and we would sit and chat and we would play with the stuff that they gave us, any of the paper goods, anything that's disposable. And we started making things out of that. It was only about 4 years ago that we actually thought, you know, some of these are kind of interesting. We actually want to start documenting them. So we started taking some images of these things and realized that, you know, with the right photograph, these things became very grand. This particular one, 4th of July, New York Harbor, is made out of chopstick wrappers and toothpicks. All these things are actually shot in the restaurant, made only with the materials that they give us. We don't bring any tools, we don't bring scissors, tape, glue, anything like that.
We actually have rules that we've devised for this and we still don't really know why.
True. Because that way we can break them. There's something to break. And I'm going to read the text for the 4th of July, New York Harbor, just this one piece. A silhouette of liberty rises against the backdrop of the night sky. She reads from a book of practical knowledge, the date July 4th, 1776, replaced with instructions in the proper use of chopsticks. Her copper on iron construction has been supplanted by chopstick wrappers and toothpicks. She is built of the stuff of immigrants, and she is the embodiment of the hope and dreams that America offers. Come to America, the land of plenty, and you will eat. But this is a land of both immense freedoms and ironies. The erection of the Statue of Liberty was widely criticized as many Americans voiced the opinion that the expense of erecting it was a frivolous waste of money, that only Americans should design American public artworks. Some even argued that the torch should not be lit until the United States became a free nation for all its inhabitants.
Not a bad idea.
Her installation was completed in 1886, just 4 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, the first of many discriminatory laws designed to bar Chinese laborers from attaining citizenship. Similar restrictions on immigration would target nearly every ethnic group seeking citizenship thereafter.
So this particular piece, even though you go, oh, Statue of Liberty, it's cool. Look what they made out of wrapping papers. Because it's made out of chopsticks, it's important. Because the colors in it are sort of this red and green, it's the copper that the structure was made of. You know, there's even I think those are chopstick. There's a fortune cookie thing in the middle of it, which, you know, give me your tired, you're poor, could also apply to that. So even though they are fun and they really do talk about our collaboration together, they are also very serious in another way. Now, not all of them are quite as serious, but they are very, very serious, and they have very deep meanings. We don't always know that at dinner when we're making them, but all of a sudden it evolves over time as we start to really think what we've done, you know, and it becomes sort of an important thing. This one is called Masonic G-spot. So it really doesn't have anything to do with a G-spot, except for it's not a sexual thing, for those of you who might be going there. But indeed, this is one, it's kind of a fun thing in that we made this at a dinner at a place that my father liked very much, and he's passed away now, but he was a Mason, and I found out later that Larry's father was a Mason. And we have no real ties to that, but all of a sudden this piece appeared, if you will, on the table one night. And as we were making it, neither of us knew what the G stood for. But we thought it was a G, but we weren't really sure, you know, and then we thought, well, it's got to be for God, right? Or we didn't know.
Or geometry.
Or geometry. Well, we found that out later. And so we made this little construction that we thought kind of looked like what we both vaguely remembered. And we went home and it's actually very accurate. And the G does stand for God or geometry, which is interesting, those of you who like the Da Vinci codes and all that.
This is a piece we did in an Indian restaurant. It's called Sukrasattva. This entire piece was made out of a sugar packet, so it's about this big probably. Very tiny. In fact, we almost accidentally threw it out once.
And the guy on there is actually a baker. So
we did this piece in the restaurant, and we created this mudra, this multi-armed, figure. And the waiter came up and asked us if we had done this piece, and he looked at it for a minute. And
well,
then
he asked it like this. He said, "Did you do this?" And then we immediately went, "Yeah." We thought, and he's not going to like this at all. So go ahead.
So he actually went back to the kitchen. He brought out the people from the back, and they came up to the table, and they were all admiring it. Some people bowed to this. So it actually became a very powerful thing. It was surprising to us, again, the fact that you can create sort of a shrine out of almost nothing, something so unimportant in a way, but it became meaningful to other people. So in the same way that the tower did, we no longer kind of take for granted that these things are always necessarily tongue-in-cheek, but recognize that this could potentially have greater meaning for somebody else. This is an environmental piece called Species in the Balance. Again, part of the beauty of this and the challenge of this is, as an artist, trying to work with nothing. When you have the most minimal materials and you think, what can I possibly do with this? And I would say 9 times out of 10, we're just on the verge of giving up. And then there's, one of us will tweak one little thing, and suddenly there's a light bulb, and the other will pick it up and kind of make changes to it, and something emerges. So the idea of making something like this that stands out of, with no glue, no tape, nothing like that, is really difficult. This stands because they gave us an orange for dessert. We stuck the straw in the orange. We tied these, and also, those little paper napkin rings that they give you with a little bit of adhesive on it is absolute gold to us when we do these.
We could build a building with those things.
Yeah.
Oh, it's also important to note, especially for the art students in here, that these actually, we've determined, become public art in situ. I mean, they're we're sitting in a restaurant, and some people say playing with your food. It's not quite that simple, but we're playing with the detritus from our food. So it also talks about ecology and the environment. But then the people around you start to become involved in the process. And you may have seen the one over there with the ballerina in it. For that particular one, there was a guy sitting next to us, and he leans over at one point and he goes, "What are you doing?" And we said, "Well, we're making something." And he goes, "You're artists, aren't you?" And we said, "Yeah, we are." And he goes, "Well, what are you making?" And I said, "Well, actually," he says, "it's a ballerina, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." The guy got up in the middle of a sizzler And he started dancing and twirling. And he goes, "Not bad for 80, huh?" And so here's a case where somebody saw art. They experienced art. And, that was probably the first thing from their mind that evening, is going to see somebody make art. But here we were making it, and it became this community endeavor, this happening, if you will. And that is what really delights us about these things, outside of the fact that we get to work together. Oh, and our dinners are tax deductible.
That's true.
That came about year 2.
So eventually these things moved on from still photography, although we still do that, and we realized some of these things actually wanted to move. And then we had to kind of think of ways to actually make that happen, which included everything from stop motion animation to puppetry and wind power and anything we could possibly think that would make these things actually move in some way.
This is another one, just before he hits it. For those students in the room, again, when you think you have nothing to work with, or maybe your finances are directed toward food this particular month. This is, we went to a Thai restaurant and we had nothing to work with. They had cloth napkins, God forbid. What are we going to do with that?
Too nice for us, too upscale.
Yeah. And so we have to, go to our restaurants that we can afford. But so at the end of the meal, we said, well, we wanted to make something tonight, but there was nothing there. At the end of the meal, they brought us a mint. And this is the wrapper.
Change now.
So we think that's probably one of the most obviously minimalist, but it's a little bit of a nod to Yoko Ono and her music. We did do all the music ourselves as well.
So this is the last piece. This is the candy store. These are in some way related to Klaus Oldenburg's store from 1961. He did this, he came out of abstract expressionism, and at that time the idea of even making a representation of something was considered absolutely ridiculous if you were, considered a serious artist. He decided he was actually going to go beyond that, not just make a representation of objects, but make sort of a physical representation of those things as well. And he would set up the store and he would sell, one day it would be dresses and clothing, and the other day it might be food, elements like this.
He did some great little candy bars too.
Still with the abstract expressionists maybe feel for the paint, and you could see sort of the texture and the love of playing with the paint. Our piece is similar to that in that we're kind of blurring the line between commodity and art also, but we also have this thing where we're also talking about the potential power and harm of the medical system. We're talking about marketing, especially things like tobacco.
A little bit of corporate greed thrown in for fun.
And this is a piece that kind of like constantly changes. So the first time we showed it, it was at the California Center for the Arts, so it really occupied sort of the small case. It had a few of the, I think, important ideas. It had some of the canopic vessels, which are actually made with medications ground up in the glazes and then fired. So those things had medications in them physically. And it also had the candy boxes, and it had some of the tobacco bears, which talks about marketing. And the idea behind this was that we used the cigar boxes, which are really, they have these beautiful graphics. They're very catchy. People use them for jewelry boxes and for purses. And so we kind of...
They're also frightening.
Exactly, in a way. And the bears are themselves too, because they're kind of like simplified versions. Probably if you put this on the Antiques Roadshow, somebody would say, obviously these are 200 years old and made on a plantation where they had no materials to work with. But it talks about the idea of marketing, and we've incorporated that into the pieces. So the idea of marketing this, which some people in an art context think of as kind of shameless, is actually appropriate for this thing completely.
And these are a couple of the vessels, and the iconography that you see on the vessels actually has to do with the medication that is actually ground up into the glazes. It's like this one, the orange one here is Vioxx, and Vioxx was a medication that was out for pain, and it was actually fairly good for pain, but it also seemed to be killing people with heart attacks. So, there's a balance. But you can see on the top that there are legs on there, and again, we borrowed from all those molds that woman gave us. But this one has deer legs on it, so if you have pain, generally it hits you first in your joints. Mm-hmm. So we put these things on here. The Darvocet is, was that a mood enhancer or something?
No, it's again a pain.
Oh, that's a pain pill. It's a pain pill. That's right. It's a pain pill, but it's one of those that will really knock you down. And so you might actually start to see these spotted cats.
And we also recognize, once we started gathering these things to actually put into the glazes, we realized, just how many medications over the course of time you actually use. They're in the shelves and you don't really think about them and they might be out of date. This shows us kind of grinding them up and putting them into the glaze. And here are a couple others from that. The candy is actually color-coded so that these things become like talismans. So, if you can't afford health care or insurance, you can have one of these things and hold it close to you, and you get, if nothing else, maybe the placebo benefit.
Oh, and when people actually found out that we had some old Vioxx, we had people calling us up and say, can I have one of those? I said, we don't do that.
That's a boundary we can't cross with this project. There are some.
But that's why we started making the little candies that they could carry around with them, and maybe the placebo effect would work.
As I said, this is a piece that kind of grows and changes depending on the venue. So after that show, we actually took this to Tijuana, and this was a place called La Casa del Tunel, which was actually a drug smuggling tunnel that they discovered. They filled in the drug smuggling tunnel, and then they got a really nice Annenberg grant and turned this into an art foundation. And you can see the wall just beyond. It was right on the very edge of the parking lot for the U.S.
Yeah, this right here is the actual border.
And these are a couple of our interns helping us. That's Sarah Watlington and Zach Wilkie. And one of the pieces that we did, there was also this piece called Passages, which dealt with the fact that this was a smuggling tunnel and people were constantly also going across. So we created these vans and we cut these teardrop shapes out and actually made necklaces out of them, and these became luminaria for people who crossed, and maybe either you separated from those people in the crossing or perhaps they died. And these became things that people could actually take and keep as a memorial and wear them.
So the candy store does change from each venue. We actually add new pieces to it as it goes, and sometimes we subtract pieces if we don't think that it's appropriate for a particular venue. So this is one of that case.
Yeah, La Casa is kind of a famous place. They're actually the hotel across the street. They did have narco corridos talking about that particular hotel as a crossing point.
So you can see it grew just a little bit when we took it over to Tijuana. And there's all kinds of stories we'll talk about later about bringing it back across the border with Vioxx and Vicodin written on those.
Yes, it took a year to get that show back, one box at a time, because the gallery owners were just terrified they were going to get stopped. This was one of the changes in the context, depending on how you place them, the idea of these lab coats kind of hovering at body level above this body. And the body is actually made from, we call it toxic cocktails, but it's made from swizzle sticks. The swizzle sticks have carved in them the names of medications that have been removed from the market by the FDA because they were deemed not to be safe. So the swizzle sticks themselves kind of articulate into the joints of this really beautifully and look very much like a skeleton.
This is also a piece that was shown at Space for Art with your museum studies class here. So we didn't put it in this one because we didn't want it to be redundant.
We did sort of a one-day episode at Agitprop Gallery. It was kind of an educational opportunity. But the high point of this, I think, was the placement of the video. You can see there was a video wall. We created a video that was first a marketing campaign so that we could actually afford to send this thing to Tijuana. But the rest of it had, at the very end, cigarette commercials from the 50s and 60s, and everybody above a certain age knew those songs, and they were whistling along with them or singing with them. And then you notice there was a transition from the tobacco commercials, and then when those became illegal, they transitioned into pharmaceutical commercials, and you'd see commercials that said, tell your doctor you'd like the little purple pill or whatever it happened to be.
Which you all are accustomed to seeing now.
Right, which has been followed by, lawyer commercials, if you've been harmed by this medication. So you start to see these weird transitions. The commercials, this is an actual, Flintstones commercial sponsored by Winston Cigarettes.
And that was Barney and Fred smoking out behind the garage so Wilma and Betty wouldn't find them.
And we also found this thing online. And I'll show it to you first, and we'll tell you what it is.
Thanks, David.
Good night, David.
Isn't that beautiful?
So this was an Edison kinetoscope made in 1897. This was one of the first moving pictures ever made. And one of the first things they thought to do with this amazing technology and all the potential that it had was, let's sell cigarettes.
So is it any wonder people had trouble stopping?
So it's certainly deeply ingrained in the culture. So we saw this and we started thinking, well, when we saw the Indian there, and it was sort of a fake American Indian, someone dressed as an American Indian, we thought, well, we'd like to do something with a cigar store Indian. We wanted to do something that didn't have sort of the ramifications of that. And at the same time, we were looking at these images of Colombia, and Colombia is sort of the embodiment of the Americas. And so we thought maybe there's a way to find some sort of natural combination of these two things. There's Columbia pictures, Columbia from the Capitol building, and this is one of our interns who posed for the sculpture that we ended up making.
Which is sitting over in the gallery now. Not our intern, but the sculpture.
That's how we made it. Smoking Columbia.
So what you're seeing in here, this piece is based on something that really started our country, and we were founded on tobacco industry. And it had become, it's a little bit less now, but it's still being marketed to the students here. So if you're smoking, stop. And if you haven't started, don't. But nonetheless, this image here, we decided Columbia was the appropriate image to actually put some tobacco leaves on. And a friend of ours from that La Casa del Tunel had in his possession some tobacco leaves. We don't know where they came from. It might have been Cuba, but we didn't ask. And so we actually put some of those tobacco leaves on this piece and around the cigar. They're really wood, but they look like cigars. So we thought that was important to the structure of the candy store. And then finally, same image of our intern on here smoking. We decided that we would make some tobacco papers. And these are handmade, and they actually have tobacco in the papers. And we decided to make these as sort of gift cards for people that you wanted to stop smoking, or maybe if there's somebody in your life who wouldn't stop smoking, you write a little letter to them, or as condolence if they actually passed away. And something kind of important with this candy store piece to know is that artists are often motivated by personal things, and in my life, I have a brother who actually died from using pharmaceuticals that were prescribed to him, and he misused them. That was important. I also had 2 parents who passed away of cancer from smoking. So, it's not my little own tirade about this, but it's something that people need to be associated with and understand. So we try and use a little bit of humor, poking fun at things, but also very, very serious.
Okay, and so those were some of the new pieces of rad when we took this thing to San Francisco at Mission Cultural Center for Latino Arts. And it was a wonderful show. And they said, "Are you okay doing Spanish language radio?" And we said, "Sure, we'd be happy to do interviews, but we don't speak Spanish." And so we went into the radio booth, and it was a great interview, I think. But every once in a while, the person who would forget to do the translations, and they would just look at us, and there was like this blank moment of silence, which isn't good on radio. I say, "I think what you're trying to say is," but we talked about the candy store, and they did a lot of outreach, which was great. And it changes for every venue, so we've got some new additions for the show that we have here. The first mechanical pieces that we've really done in association with this. The medical Mastaba Ferris wheel, which has some medications from our cabinet and some from others' cabinets. We actually had a dinner party, and we had some friends come, and they asked if they could bring anything for dinner, and we said, yes. Do you have any extra
old
pill bottles
medications
in your cabinet? You can empty them out if you'd like. And so we incorporated some of those things into this piece. And then finally, it's just recreational, which is a really fun piece for us because we realized when we painted the scenes around the outside edge that this is like the first time we painted in 15 years, which was very, very much fun.
And we think we still have it.
Yes, and we argued over who was going to get to paint each panel. And I think that's all we have images of.
So at this point, if you want to do a little question and answer, if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to talk to you. Yes?
How long are your dinner sessions?
It depends. The longest one was about 3 hours.
Oh, wow.
And that was for the piece called Holy Rollers at Tony Roma's. But most of the time, it happens even sometimes while we eat, so it can be like 15 minutes. The photography of it is the thing that really takes the longest, I think, because it's all about the artist's eye and seeing where it's going to look the best.
Each one of the photos, we might shoot 50 photos before we get to one. Like the version of Guadalupe Chipotle that's in there on the wall. We took endless photos of this, and the very last one, some weird thing happened, and there was a color shift, and it went from silver to gold. And we thought,
that's gold. I mean, that's the only
it's a
thing
miracle.
Yeah.
That's the one.
We do a lot of works that just end up being miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
Did you ever get kicked out of a restaurant?
Out of a restaurant?
No, but
No.
You can tell that they're usually thinking about it at first because we're going to places where everything's disposable.
And they want you to get in and eat and out.
Exactly.
You know?
It's a strange thing when people hang out for more than 20 minutes, something's wrong. So, first they'll start kind of cruising the place and looking out of the side of their head. And then we notice that the wait staff will start to come by every once in a while and look at what we're doing. And before we're done, they'll usually get involved and they'll ask, can we bring anything else? And they'll bring people over to see
Oh,
what
as a
we're
matter of fact, these kind people here, the Gartners, we introduced us to a place in Escondido called Sushiyama. And they're really great staff there because we work there a lot, and they give you a lot of paper, and it's wonderful. But unfortunately, they're very, very diligent about coming by and cleaning up. So they've thrown away 2 of our pieces.
If you read in the book, we actually made a book with all of these boats in it, and then we realized one of the vessels was missing, and there's a guy floating there. So we had to create a story to make up for the fact that somebody pulled the piece out and took it away.
Yeah,
Do you keep them or do you leave them
we
there?
do. No, we keep them. Could we have a doggy bag, please? And they understand at that point, it's...
And that's also part of the beauty of it, is like the staging of the photograph. When you look at the objects themselves, they can look completely like junk. In fact, we had an intern that wanted to see, there was one with the dinosaur, and he was dying to see it. And we brought it out, and it's like, oh, that's it. It's this little pile of napkin, which is really kind of nothingness. But again, it's all about, how you perceive it, and how you view it, and getting that perfect image, capturing that moment.
But we have shown those with them before, and it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. We just didn't think it was appropriate here, space-wise, number 1, and number 2, it just sometimes looks nice just to see the finished work.
Yeah.
Yes?
Well, I was just wondering, I know you didn't know how hard it was going to be, but why did you decide on 8 feet?
For
The
8.
columns?
the columns.
Yeah.
Because, do you see the little variegated sections in there? Those are those vases? No, they're vases.
Possibly. We
And
don't
so
know.
when you stack them up, that's what looked good. It's about aesthetics, I think.
Well, I'd actually say some of our most interesting collaborations are with people who aren't artists. We're really interested in sciences, and those are kind of the conversations that we have at events, and we realize, there's a way to kind of like work in a different way. There's actually a wonderful physicist here, Dr.
He's
Mark
right over
Teitel.
here.
And we draw him into our projects every once in a while. We deal with something where the science is a little bit nebulous for us, and he can kind of put it in layman's terms. We did a piece called Electric Fields of California that is a piece where we lit fluorescent bulbs with the ambient electromagnetic fields from power towers. Just, you could stand outside and hold these things in your hand. It's a really beautiful effect.
They're the
And
same
then-
light bulbs you have in here, by the way, only
Exactly.
longer.
So, we have, he's a generous enough person to let us, invade his house and figure out, how these things actually work. And every once in a while when we do something with sciences that's kind of we definitely pull him in.
And of course, our interns, we use a lot of interns, and they are, they always come in first very shy and okay, what would you like me to do? And then finally we go, tell us what you think about this, engage us. And we share those ideas. So on our website, actually, jugglingclines.com, by the way, we have dedicated a page to our interns that have worked with us at the house because they're so important to us.
So most of your ceramic work appears to be done with molds. How did you do the Columbia?
Columbia was actually carved out of foam, like a very dense foam used for architecture.
Which most of the things in California, I think by law now, have to be done with this architectural foam because other things would fall off of buildings during earthquakes. So it won't hurt you if it falls off.
And that, like a lot of these projects, for us is about experimentation. So we like using media that we haven't really used before, and then we try to think, how far can you push it before something failed?
But I had a question about the process of working together. Because, you think of artists as usually they're individuals working on their own, and I've collaborated with people, and it's tricky sometimes. Some people you can work with very well, and sometimes. And so how does that work? Do you always agree? Do you ever fight over who's going to do what? Do you always? I'm just interested in that.
When we first started, when I had a museum career of like 20 years before I came here to make art with Larry, and before we made the decision, we decided to actually, again, draft rules to a certain extent on what we were going to do because I cherish my marriage with him. And I've known other artists who tried to collaborate and they ended up, going in different directions. So it's one of mutual respect. If somebody has an idea, you don't go, oh, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. No. Even if you think it.
You trying to tell me something?
No. I thought you were trying to tell me something. But, and those don't always work. We definitely disagree on things. We actually write together, if you can imagine, and we write music together as well. And those are very intimate processes, and to do that together is hard. Sometimes it's, if we're writing music, somebody will be sitting at the computer and, with the keyboard and doing all kinds of crazy things with the music on those videos. And then you get to a point where you go, okay, done, tag team, you do it. I can't do it anymore.
Although, yeah, I do think we have also a lot of similar skill sets. We have different ones, but we also cross over. So
Yeah.
I don't think there's any territory where one of us that's their thing to do and the other one does something else. And that means that a lot of these projects, when we look at the final process or the final product, it's kind of difficult to even say who did what on some of these things. And which is
We don't
actually
know sometimes now. Oh, that was a good idea I had. He goes, well, I had that idea. Oh. I think that was mine. Which is great.
And in the end, doesn't matter really.
Yeah. So, yes, and sometimes we do argue about things, but it's not the kind of arguing that will ever lead to a separation, because we also know that this is kind of sappy, but we know that our marriage is cemented with love and respect. And we can have those controversies, right?
And stucco and cement
Yeah, and stucco and cement.
and clay.
And mud.
Yeah.
And, and we know that it will survive. If you get mad and walk away and you finally come back and go, okay, I'm sorry. And that's okay.
But I mean, it's hard for me to even remember what it was like to work alone.
Yeah.
It seems so natural now.
And again, it's a little bit sappy, but when we don't work together and we're away from each other, I miss him. God, this is
Yeah. When the big heart fills the screen.
to a beaver. I worked at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and then the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and then out here at the California Center for the Arts Museum. And you?
And I was also a museum photographer, and I worked at Indianapolis Museum of Art and the Art Institute, and I did some shoots for the MCA in Chicago and for various galleries. And then we moved out here.
So we also curate exhibitions and do that kind of stuff together, and that's great fun. When I said we write together, we actually have written a couple catalogs. We do argue about semantics, but I figure if that's the worst thing you argue about, you're okay. Yeah.
Do you guys, a couple questions. Do you work out of your home? Is that your studio per se, or do you just use restaurants?
Oh.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, I drag my saw into a
You don't have
restaurant.
to actually rent it.
I was wondering and where you store all your all the artwork pieces. And I was also wondering, you said you more recently started developing animated artwork, like the carousel, like the Ferris wheel. Is that a direction you're going in, or do you have any?
Yeah.
Or did the new ideas just pop up and you go with them, or where are you going?
Well, that's a book. So, in answer to your questions, where did you start with that? We work at home. We work at home. So when we want to get away from work, we leave home. And we actually create a lot on the road when we're out driving around. We share ideas that way, and that's a very good creative time. And then, what else was there?
Where do you
So
store
the
all
house
this?
is, house is like the studio?
Yeah, we got a grant from a place called Center for Cultural Innovation out of Los Angeles, I guess in 2010, which let us do an extension onto our house, and that's also given us like a nice studio, outdoor studio, indoor, outdoor place to work, which has been nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a bona fide studio. It's more like, patio, but it's amazing.
But it helped.
We live in
but,
Escondido.
doing large
so
installations like
having
this,
shade.
eventually that stuff tends to creep into your house anyway, just
Yeah.
because you're working every place.
In storage, garage.
Yeah.
There was a time we parked a car in there, but it doesn't work that way anymore. If anyone has any storage units that they don't need, or they need to have filled with something, we'd be happy to accommodate. And Alessandra can tell you that the boxes go from floor to ceiling over in their storage area. So we actually, and because I was a registrar, though, I have everything cataloged and I know where everything is generally.
And everything was numbered. Every box was numbered. Every box was numbered. We need help when we have to pack up the show. So.
This is a call for volunteers.
Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. He asked if there was a connection, if I'm right, between the different pieces, like the pills and the columns and the My Dinner with the Klines piece. I would say that there are, just because we're all human and those are things that we all face.
And for us as artists, I'd say a lot of the work that we do does deal with social issues in some way. Even the things, the dinner things, where we don't really have any kind of preconception, we just make it up on the spot. When we found we were putting them together for the book, and we said, oh wait, these are categorized. There's like something about religion, there's stuff about politics, there's stuff about like all these different issues. So I think that just kind of naturally comes out.
And that's a human characteristic as well, just to make sense of your world and sort of compartmentalize things. It can be dangerous sometimes to compartmentalize things. It's like when you go to art fairs, sometimes they will have, photography over here and sculpture over here and paintings over here, and they shouldn't touch. But it's okay if they do. Our art fair here doesn't do that, but some other art fairs does. And it's as an artist, that's just kind of interesting to watch. But anybody else? I hope you're not too exhausted. We have enjoyed this so much, and we thank each and every one of you for spending time with us.
Such a scene, and I'm dirty. Oh, and yes, I bear the stain. And although I may be righteous, my own mouth may bear me blame. Please drop me in the water, oh, and scrub me on the stone, so that I'll be wearing purest white when they call my body